Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford University. This is our Friday lecture series, and today we are having some of you joining us through YouTube into our live stream. Since this is a webinar and it's being live streamed on our class website, YouTube webpage, the lecture will continue to be available for you to rewatch once the live stream has ended. Kindly submit any questions or comments you have through the YouTube chat, and I will make sure that I can read your questions to Dr. Mazzuca after his presentation. I do want to let you know that here, at least at Stanford, we now have a new land acknowledgement, native land acknowledgement that has been prepared by our students, our center here at Stanford. Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. This is a script that is now sanctioned by our Native American community here at Stanford. We have been doing land acknowledgements here at Stanford Bolivar House Center for Latin American Studies for several years now. And I do want to note that if you have not learned or found about the original peoples that inhabit the place where you are, please take some time to at least learn about them. And if you can support some of their organizations, it would be greatly appreciated. So thank you again. Today we have the talk, the title is Latecomer State Formation, Political Geography and Capacity Failure in Latin America by Sebastián Mazzuca. I have to say that, I'm very pleased that we have Sebastián with us, Dr. Mazzuca with us today. One of my colleagues in the profession says that the greatest feeling we as scholars can have is envy. And let me be clear about this, but it is when you find a book and you look at it and you read it, or a paper, and you think, oh, I wish I had written this. So this is the way I feel about some of the work that Sebastián is going to share with us today. He's, I don't know why I don't have it here, but he's a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He graduated in political science and economics from the University of California at Berkeley. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Academy for International and Area Studies. His work, as you will see, focuses on questions of state formation, regime change, and economic development. He has a couple of books out very recently, but one is the book he's going to be talking about, Latecomer State Formation, Political Geography and Capacity Failure in Latin America, Yale University Press, 2021. And he has, been a very, prolific author in the last few years. But the other book I would point you out to is the Middle Quality Institutional Trap, which is with Gerardo Munck, Cambridge University Press, 2020. So thank you so much for joining us. And please, Sebastián, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alberto. I am genuinely delighted to be here, share ideas with you, share my work. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Let me share the screen. Okay, and hopefully everything will work. Can you see that? Good. So this is the book I'm going to talk about, Latecomer State Formation. Really, I want you to preview that I'm going to try to convey two main messages, two big ideas. There are more ideas in the book, hopefully, than two, but I want just to use that as the key platform for discussion. Is just two ideas. This book is mostly about 19th century Latin America, yet sort of the prologue would be that there's a pretty strong consensus, and I think the consensus can only get stronger, that state formation is a critical juncture, in the sense that how or when a state is formed has a big impact on the trajectory of of the country that is forming the state. So it's a critical juncture, and it has a very important legacy. So in a way, this is connecting the two books, because this is a book about quality of democracy in contemporary Latin America, and to a great extent, this is a legacy of what I studied in the 19th century. We can talk more about that, but sort of, it's not that I'm a historian. I wish I were a historian. I'm not. I wrote a history book there mostly, or I looked deep into history, 19th century, because I'm concerned about the present, really. But I could not avoid but just look for historical causes. So this is the motivation of the book. Okay, so first idea, okay? I think first big idea is a distinction between state formation and state building. Okay, so these are concepts that have been used interchangeably, and to me it's crucial that we separate them, and I draw a very sharp distinction between the two of them. Even though it sounds counterintuitive, then I don't care about the terminology, but the concepts should be different. So state formation is essentially about two things: territory consolidation and violence monopolization. This sort of derives from the fundamental definition of the state by Weber. So territory consolidation and violence monopolization, that's state formation. And picture this: you get a territory and violence is monopolized within that territory, then you get a state. On the other hand, state building is just building state capacity, the infrastructural power of Michael Mann in a way. It starts with the extinction of patrimonial power, which is essentially local notables, potentates that use or fuse private and private economic and political power. And so states building starts with that, because otherwise the state cannot deploy its capacity, and then it creates capacity after the extinction of patrimonialism. That's state building. That is what I call state building. So I would just want to have a footnote here that some of you might find interesting. I find state formation as equivalent to country creation in many ways. Once a state is formed, you have a country. Without a state, you don't have a country. And so I think there's a sort of one-to-one relation. So this is essentially, we call it state formation, but if we want to talk to, I don't know, to our aunt or uncle about it, or a friend, or it's just about country creation, it makes sense. Technically, is state formation is demarcation of a territory and violence and the monopolization of violence within it, which is a little bit more technical, but it's there. Okay, so given this distinction that I'm open to criticisms and all kinds of things, but I'm very persuaded by it. Given this distinction, I can ask what I think is the fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, under what conditions these two processes, the process of state formation on the one hand and the process of state building, are coupled, decoupled, or becoming compatible? So essentially, if you separate these two analytically, these two phenomena, then you can ask questions about their relation. That's why it's so important to make the conceptual disaggregation, to separate these two processes. And so the question that my book tries to answer is whether, under what conditions and through which mechanisms, state formation is coupled with state building, it's potentially decoupled, or it's a barrier to state building. Okay, so that is the question that I want to answer. This is the sort of the political science, political sociology part of it, and this is try to pay attention to it. It's a little bit technical, but I think it's sort of the core to get at one level, a layer deeper than the superficial level. This is the key thing. So we have state. Do you see the cursor, by the way? Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, so you have state development there, and the disaggregation. I'm not sure I like this word, but I like these two as separate phenomena: state formation and state building. I already claimed that state formation is about violence monopolization and territory consolidation, and state building is this idea of creating bureaucratic capacity, what Weber called bureaucratization, even though it's a bad word. technically it's capacity building. Okay, so in territory consolidation, in every process of state formation, in almost every process of state formation, almost always and everywhere, when you have territory consolidation, you have a center. And the center can be London, can be Mexico City, can be Philadelphia, can be New York. They incorporate a periphery. That is what's to consolidate a territory. So there is always, when you create a territory, a center and the periphery of that center. Unless you're in Luxembourg, so maybe that's just a center. But in general, countries have a center and a periphery. And so territory consolidation, the key aspect of it is periphery incorporation, okay? So this is the key question. This old question about whether it's coupled, decoupled, or incompatible is really one about periphery incorporation. And the question is whether periphery incorporation is also periphery transformation. When a center incorporates a periphery, whether it transforms it or not, whether sort of it invades it with capacity or not, and transforms local practices, changes institutions, deploys capacity, and so on and so forth. If you have periphery transformation, you have the precondition for state capacity and public goods. If you don't have periphery transformation, you are going to have the local potentates, local notables, ruling in a clientelistic fashion, essentially, patrimonial fashion. Okay, so this is really sort of the secret. This is in the form of varieties of periphery incorporation, if we want to be super specific about state formation and state building. Okay, so let me start with what we know. I think we know a lot about state formation, and obviously the sort of the benchmark theory and the benchmark stylized facts for state formation come from Europe, and that's why I have a picture of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. This is a foundational period of states in Europe, and there's a big phenomenon called the military revolution. And the military revolution and so essentially state formation in Europe is very closely linked to war making, in the sense that the starting point is a very Darwinian scenario of rulers fighting each other. And if they don't fight each other, they're preparing to fight each other. And in that preparation, in that competition, like every competition, like the competition between Apple and Samsung, there are a number of innovations. And so one of those innovations is the state. In the process of geopolitical competition, you have the state. And the amazing thing about Western Europe is that state formation, that formation of states, violence monopolization, and territory consolidation, involved the incorporation and the transformation of the periphery, precisely because of the nature, the Darwinian nature of the incentives there. And this is because if a center incorporates an area, a periphery, and it doesn't administer that periphery efficiently, then it's going to lose to a war and it's going to be absorbed. So essentially, you got an equilibrium outcome in which either the states have the capacity, have built capacity, or if they have not built the capacity, they are absorbed by other countries that have built the capacity. So essentially, in equilibrium, you have capable states in Western Europe, and so this is the stylized facts. I like this benchmark very much. Now, this obviously this theory is being questioned or qualified, but it's still a useful theory. It goes back to Weber. Tilly made it famous with states make wars and wars make state, and so on. There's sort of this guy, right? This guy is Robin Hood, and it's a hero. But we are political scientists, right? And I read this as most of us, when I was a kid, when we were kids, and I don't know, maybe I was 8 or 9, and read the tales, the pediatric version of the Robin Hood tales, and loved Robin Hood. But on second reading, with a more mature longer versions of the tales, I started to like, instead of Robin Hood, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Really, the hero, the Sheriff of Nottingham, became the hero to me. And the villain was Robin Hood. And why is that? Well, because the Sheriff of Nottingham was creating states. The other was a bandit. And so this is the tale. So it's a tale. You know, what would the novel be? The novel, or what the real history is. It's not about, in the tale you have Robin Hood and the under Sheriff of Nottingham, and they are fighting each other, and they're like a Tom and Jerry, fine, and they're chasing each other, and okay, fine. But in the novel, so if you get the context, you know that this Sheriff of Nottingham was sent by a higher authority, who was the king or the queen. And then he was not really chasing Robin Hood. Robin Hood was chasing him, but the under Sheriff of Nottingham was trying to tax the aristocracy, the rich, the notables. That's where the money was. So really, he was building states. He was liquidating, essentially, fighting against local rulers to create central authority. So the English queen or king, they incorporated territory, but they transformed them through taxation, through essentially the abolition of political power from local notables. Okay. And so this is the stylized facts of course, if we want to even make the picture bigger, we know that this guy was collecting taxes, not because he had a king inside, but also because he had France outside, right? Because it was the pressures of France who made England engage in a geopolitical race, arms race, and then we have the full picture. In Robin Hood, right? And so the Robin Hood is very interesting, but we have to sort of understand that for a political scientist, Robin Hood is the villain, the hero is the Sheriff of Nottingham, and then the bigger context, the things that are not there, the English state maker and the pressures that the state maker was suffering from France, or from the state that was being formed in France or in Spain, wherever. So this is pretty well known. And what is fascinating, really fascinating at this point, is that there are a number of area studies, very inspiring area studies. The study of Africa, of Latin America, of Southeast Asia, of Turkey, that they say, well, you know what, Tilly does not apply there. Tilly does not apply. This idea of war making as state making, or state formation as war making, it does not apply. And this is, I think this is a superb argument by Jeffrey Herbst on Africa. He says, you know, really, in Africa, it doesn't apply. The key word there is population density. In Africa, land, as opposed to Europe, is abundant and people are scarce. So really, and they're mobile. So state formation is not the same in Africa as it is in Europe. Then we have this other wonderful book that also says Tilly does not apply. Tilly does not apply to the Ottoman Empire. Well, because in the Ottoman Empire, you have too many Robin Hoods, you didn't have really outside competition, you had too many bandits. And it's all about the deals, and not the struggle between the Ottoman rulers and the bandits, but about negotiation and indirect rule and incorporating bandits to centralization. So that is another case that says, well, Tilly doesn't work. Finally, we have another wonderful book on Latin America, which probably most of you have read, Blood and Death by Miguel Ángel Centeno. Says Tilly does not apply. Well, Tilly sort of apply, but in a strange way. He says, well, the wars that Latin American rulers fought were not intense enough. Then they created weak states, and the weak states are actually fight low intensity wars because they are weak. So you have state weakness causing low intensity wars, or very intermittent wars causing weak states. So you have this vicious circle of low intensity wars and weak states. And these books are very inspiring, and they're probably, they get super original ideas that I envy in the way that Alberto has mentioned. By the way, that's a big honor, because I've always envied him, by the way, and this is not just throwing each other's flowers. But so we have this picture. Chile does not apply to, maybe applies to Europe, to Western Europe, does not apply to Africa, does not apply to the Ottoman Empire, does not apply to China, does not apply to Latin America, and so on and so forth. I don't like this. Even though I like it individually, I like very much, it's one of these books and many others that are out there. These are just 3 examples in which Chile does not apply. I don't like it because there's a lack of systematic theory for this. Well, how can we build a systematic theory of state formation that is not something that's very specific, region specific? And let me bring here an example of what I sort of mean. You know, I always find this guy, Borges, very interesting. And this is, you don't need to read the passage. So if you want, you read it or just listen to my version of it. He talks about a taxonomy that he found in a book called The Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, a Chinese encyclopedia, probably. And so that Chinese encyclopedia provides a classification, a taxonomy of animals. And that's the point. The point is just to classify animals in the same way that we could classify regions. And in that classification, we have very strange animals, like the ones belonging to the emperor, embalmed, trained, piglets, mermaids, fabulous, loose dogs, included in this classification, that shake like crazy, countless, drawn with a very fine camel hairbrush, etc., that have broken the vase that look like flies from a distance. So this is a crazy classification. Why is it crazy? Why is it crazy? Well, it's crazy because taxonomy should be fundamentally what we want from taxonomies is that the categories are mutually exclusive, which is something that we don't know there, because maybe a piglet does belong to the emperor, and we can imagine that a piglet could be drawn with a very fine camel hair brush. So it's not mutually exclusive. And then that collectively, that they're exhaustive, that at every creature there belongs into a category, and this doesn't work. And this is the problem with these theories, I guess, in the aggregate. I really don't know what conditions, under what conditions states are created. So every one of these books talks about something that's very specific to the region, that says state formation is different because this region has this, almost like a proper name, like a fixed effect. Okay, so what I do, and this is my second contribution, the second big idea I have. No, I don't think it's big. The second, in the context of this, in the context of this talk, the other half of the talk, the master sort of idea is that, well, instead of focusing on region-specific attributes, I want to ask about whether I can classify the processes of state formation by understanding the international environment under which they occur. Okay, so how do we classify international environments? And it's very simple. To me, it's just like go back to basics, right? So there's a geopolitical dimension to every international environment. And IR people will kill me if I do this, but I have to borrow from them a little bit, and I simplified what they know. And they tell us that the world can have a single power, can be a bipolar world, or can be a multipolar world, or whatever. So to me, the key distinction there is whether the world is an anarchical society in which there's no country that is a power that rules over the others or has direct or indirect influence over the other, or there's a hierarchy. Whether the geopolitical context has at least one superpower, maybe two, like in the Cold War, USSR and the USA. So that is the question, whether there's anarchy or hierarchy. And so those potentially provide for very different contexts of state formation. And then once we look at the politics of the world, we look at the economy, very basic, and this distinction I found that is very useful, and it's essentially whether state formation occurs before or after the Industrial Revolution, or before or after the emergence of capitalism, or before or after globalization. I really don't care that much what word you use. So essentially now we have a 2x2 classification of world historic times, of eras. And so because it's 2 dimensions, geopolitical and international economy, and the international economy has 2, I mean, obviously this can be a continuum in metrics, in econometrics, it would be stupid to have 2, but just like to simplify things, we have 2 possible international economies, 2 possible geopolitical contexts, and then we eventually have 4 quadrants. And this is the point now I can sort of fit in a box, right? Every region or every state formation process. I know under what circumstances, and to just let's focus for the sake of illustration and for developing the theory. So let's focus just on this quadrant, feudalism and anarchy, and then the opposite quadrant, which is when you have hierarchy and capitalism. So essentially, the starting point of the theory is that, remember, the theory has to answer when state formation is coupled with state building and when it's decoupled or when it becomes incompatible. So now I am classifying, not in the Borges sense, in a more systematic way, world historic times, which is based on international environments of state formation. And here, European states, Western Europe, formed its own states in the context of anarchy. There was no superpower. There was no superpower. There was no big power, international power. They were all more or less the same, fighting each other. You see that, the Westphalia period is essentially this. And even before is essentially this. After the fall of the Roman Empire is essentially this. And so, and also occurs before the Industrial Revolution, mostly under feudalism or mercantilism at best. So, and so this is, in this context, is what I call the pioneer state formation. The first states are formed there, pioneer, first generation of states. And that you will see that is when war makes states, and war makes states and also encourages state building. On the opposite quadrant, not the neighboring ones, the one that don't share any dimension, we have latecomer state formation, which is second generation states. And so obviously latecomer state formation, states that form later, cannot follow the same trajectory as the first generation, because the first generation didn't have a prior generation of states around them in their surroundings. So naturally, this is a very Gershon-Cronian thing. And second generations cannot repeat the path of the first generations just simply because the first generation didn't have another generation before them. So latecomer state formation comes in a period of hierarchy. And in the case of Latin America, it's very clear that the superpower there is Britain. And in fact, the period of state formation in Latin America occurs under a period that's very well known in history after the defeat of Napoleon, is the Pax Britannica. So you have a superpower. Also, you have other super important powers that eventually compete with Britain, and France, Prussia, eventually the United States. So you have superpowers. Latin America is not fighting against these guys. So that is very different. We already have an international hierarchy, which is something that Europe did not have. And also, state formation in Latin America occurred during what's called the first global, the first wave of globalization, the first globalization. So emerging markets is a fancy word for the last 20, 30 years, but the first emerging markets is really in Latin America. In the sense that there was capitalism there in the North Atlantic, and Latin America started to sell commodities, raw materials to the industrialization process in Europe. So it occurred under capitalism. And so these are really opposite, analytically opposite context, international environment for state formation, pioneer state formation, which I will claim is the same as war-led state formation, and latecomer state formation, which is essentially a trade-led process of state formation. We could think of the master crucibles of state formation almost everywhere. It's either war or trade, international threats, or expansion, geopolitical expansion, or commercial opportunities and incentives and pressures. So those are the big two forces shaping states. And so, but I say that in this context, war prevails, and in this context, trades prevail as the driving force of state formation. And so now we have a classification, and we see the main forces. Okay, so this is what I think is, how am I doing on time? Sorry, guys.
You're fine. Some 20 more minutes if you want.
Okay, great. We're super fine.
No, not 20, 15, sorry.
15, okay, good, yeah. Good, still very good. So let me spend some time then, maybe 5 minutes on tell you what I find the most fascinating thing in the history of 19th century Latin America. There are many things that are fascinating, but this is a big one. So Latin America is unbelievable. The borders, remember, state formation as territory consolidation, those territories in Latin America have been some of the most stable over the 20th century. I mean, there are few places that you have more stable states as territorial states than in Latin America. And that started essentially around 1875. All the borders were frozen and only marginal changes happened. Yet, after independence, between independence, let's say they started in 1809 or 1810, and then the process was essentially completed by 1825. From independence to state formation, you have the period of essentially state failure, and an amazing plasticity, amazing number of options that each country had for territory consolidation. What I mean is countries, the combination of territories that we see in today's maps could have taken very different paths. Let me give you some examples. This is Mexico at the moment of independence, and you will see there that if we were still there, this conference would be occurring in Mexico, I guess, because California was part of Mexico, Central America was part of Mexico, Texas, of course, which is the big trigger of all this, was part of Mexico. Okay, fine. This is 1822. So things changed dramatically. Okay, but this is the usual story, that the usual regret, and people are sad that Mexico lost that much territory, and so it's like lamentation, but things could have been much worse. If you look in the 30s and in the 40s, there were secessionist attempts in Mexico that could have radically changed the map as we see it today, and this was up for grabs. Look at Yucatan. Yucatan was a republic for an independent republic essentially for 10 years. And it wanted to be the protectorate of the British Empire, and then an association with the Spanish Empire, maybe. And then they applied for statehood in the US. And the Senate eventually said, no, we already stole enough from them in order not to create more trouble. So Yucatan, but there was this openness. It was an open-ended process. We don't know. So state formation happened in Latin America. The state formation is not something that we can gloss over. There was the main phenomena in Latin America after independence was this this hard process of country creation, of state formation. It existed because there were many options. This is Mexico. If we go to Brazil is sort of the opposite. People think that Brazil, well, Portuguese America essentially looks exactly like what Brazil looks today, and that is essentially not true. It's, if you look at since Barman's book since the 90s, we know that really Brazil could have disaggregated in a number of countries, and there were many fiscal, political, economic reasons for that disaggregation, and it could have happened. So it was an open-ended process. There was politics here. There was something was changing, and this is one republic that I also like a lot. That lasted for 10 years. It was essentially an independent republic with its own rulers, its own army, its own flag, its own anthem. But then, as in Mexico, all these secessions failed, okay? What about Central America? Well, Central America for 10 years, Central America was a single country. After secession from Mexico, and now we know it's 5-6 countries. Okay, so it's fragmented. Yet, if you look at, for instance, the work by Central American historian Jordan Adim, things could have also in Central America, which is already the smallest, the Luxembourgs of, well, Luxembourg in a way, in a territorial way, the smallest countries in the region, they could have also fragmented even further, because for a while, and this is only a couple of years, there was a small country called Los Altos which wanted to secede from Guatemala. So this was a very real possibility. And so Jordana Dims claims that every village essentially claimed for sovereignty in the period after the collapse of the Central American Federation. Okay, and this is another creature, and this is the last one, I promise. This is a country that is strange because it's a country that was also very ephemeral. Piratini was not ephemeral, Central American Federation was not ephemeral, Yucatan was ephemeral, but there were some that lasted for 10 years. This lasted only for 3 years, although it had several attempts at revival. What's distinct about this country, the Liga de los Pueblos Libres, it is actually a combination of different parts of today's countries. It's not just a small party, a small part of a country seceding from the rest of the country. It's a country that is actually a combination of small parts of other countries, parts of Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Okay, so essentially there was a lot of territorial action, a lot of territorial disaggregation and reaggregation before the territory consolidated. The territories in Latin America consolidated before countries were created. Okay, so that is really the main point. The main point about the fact of state formation in Latin America, and here is the theory. Here is the theory. So this is how the war-led state formation process unfolds, and the trade-led state formation unfolds, and it's standard, standard political economy stuff. You have the initial conditions with the budget constraints, restrictions, and all that, and then the utility function and the resources, goals, priority. So sorry. I didn't say that clearly. Let me recap. This model, each of these two models can be separated into a number of steps until you get from initial conditions to outcome. The initial conditions are the ones that define the quadrant: geopolitical anarchy, anarchy in terms of geopolitics, and feudalism in the case of war-led state formation, and hierarchy and globalization of trade, of capitalism in the case of trade-led state formation. Once we have that, those are the contexts of state formation to theoretical concepts of context of state formation. The goals are very different. Those contexts shape different goals for the rulers in those contexts. And in the war-led model, in the war-led context, you have essentially every politician wants to survive, but survival depends on war making, on preparation for war. In Latin America, survival depended on a very different thing, which is helping the export sector, because that is what provided the revenues to survive, and actually created coalitions that were viable ruling coalitions. And so more than war makers, they were market makers, the state formation agents in Latin America. This is a generalization, and this is part one of the book. In part two, I talk about distinctions here, but sort of the goal is war making in the war-led process and market making in the trade-led process. The resources are very different. In the war-led context, is internal taxation, the sheriff of Nottingham, taxing their own population, extracting resources from their own population. The resources for state building, the money, the material base for state formation in Latin America is customs, duties, taxes on international trade, revenue, and that is what provides the revenue for state formation. It's very different source of revenue. The resources are different, the priorities are different. Then finally, the strategy, remember, the strategy of periphery incorporation then becomes different. Given that these resources, the initial conditions and the goal and priorities are different, the strategy towards their own periphery of every state formation center toward the periphery are distinct. In the world process, you incorporate the periphery with transformation, and this is it. So sorry. I'm focusing here now. In the strategy of towards the periphery, given these initial conditions, priority, and resources, is incorporation of the periphery with transformation. And in Latin America, what do you do with the peripheries? Well, actually, you negotiate with them. You make deals with them. And those deals are, in many cases, still standing. Senates, party coalitions, and so on. And there are these patrimonial powers that are incorporated without transformation. The final result is strong states in the world-led state formation process and weak states in the trade-led state formation process. If I have one more minute, I can give another half an idea. Am I okay? Okay, so let me recap. And so this is essentially part one of the book. Part one of the book says state formation, we have two paths, the world-led and the trade-led. And world-led, you have the European pioneers, the trade-led, the latecomer, Latin American state formation. World-led, states are strong, trade-led, states are weak. This is part one of the book. In part two, what I do is I differentiate subpaths within the big trade-led path. And this is important because this helps you understand, because the trade-led model will tell you your states are weak. Okay, fine, that's fine. Your states are weak, enough. But it doesn't tell you what combinations of what regions are going to be combined in a country. It doesn't tell you that. It's going to tell you, well, there's going to be deals between central rulers and patrimonial peripheries, but it doesn't tell you what peripheries the center decides to incorporate or exclude, right? Because, and that is the beauty of the trade-led, I mean, that's the freedom that trade-led state formation can have. In world-led state formation, you cannot decide as freely as people decided in the trade-led state formation process in Latin America. There, I mean, now I'm getting closer to individual case studies, and I sort of say there are three agents of state formation. In Europe, there's a warrior, and in Latin America, essentially, there are three agents, which are pretty unthinkable of in the European context, except for the Lord. But in Latin America, there are three agents. Given these conditions, there are three typical agents: the port, the party, or the Lord. So then you have, in the trade-led formation, you have these three subpaths, smaller paths: port-driven, Lord-driven, and party-driven. When you have ports, and this is a sort of a booming port like Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro or Valparaiso, Santiago de Chile, is exporting massively and it has a ton of revenue, they tend to create, they have the possibility, it's not going to happen for sure, depends on political conditions. You can have territorial colossuses, big countries, because there's a port that's aggregating regions, and it's aggregating regions essentially in order to keep the patrimonial peripheries quiet so that they don't torpedo the export sector. And that is it, and that's Argentina and Brazil. Then you have sort of the most different here path in Latin America, which is the Lord-driven, the countries created by caudillos. And this is almost always a disaggregating process in which you have a big unit, like you could have, now we call it Gran Colombia, back then it was called Colombia, but Colombia in its time, Simón Bolívar's Colombia was Ecuador, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela. And then you have a local lord that finds an economic opportunity, but says, you know what? I don't like the big arena because I am the strong guy in a small arena, so I will secede from the big arena. So that option happens, and that is essentially the law-driven path is what explains the formation of Venezuela, Peru, and Guatemala. They are also secessions of potentially larger units. And the party-driven is I think is the weirdest, because here is a case in which, as opposed to classical Weberian theory, in which once you have the state and then you have the nation and then you have the parties, here you have the parties before you have the state. You have the territories consolidated, and that's how that happens. Well, read the book, but essentially parties can create states. How to create is a party creating a state? No, it's really the rivalry between two parties. So you can imagine this as liberals and conservatives fighting each other in Mexico City, in central Mexico, and they need allies in order to defeat their own local rival. And that's how they create networks. So you have national partisan networks really before having a state. Actually, in Mexico, Colombia, and Uruguay, you have civil wars. You have the territories pretty clear, but you don't have the monopolization of violence, because what you have first is partisan networks fighting each other. Okay, so this is the second half of the book. All this slide is the second half of the book with individual case studies. And so let me recap. State formation different from state building. State formation can be coupled, decoupled, or incompatible with state building. That depends, and this is the second idea, on the international environment for state formation. And there's a 2x2 typology of international environments of state formation. Out of those 4 quadrants, 2 polar opposites are war-led and trade-led. And Latin America is war-led, leading to weak states, and Europe was war-led, leading to strong states. Okay, those are the 2 big ideas. The small idea, well, the half of an idea, which actually is the biggest part of the book, the second part, is not about the difference between Europe and Latin America, but variations within Latin America. So it's about this. This is the second part of the book. And this is the subpaths and their potential for aggregation or secession, depending on who is the exact agent doing the state formation process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sebastián. I'm sorry, I did not unmute myself. So we have time for a couple of questions while we're still streaming. I'm glad we got you to talk a little bit about the second part of the book and even put some of the proper names, even though a lot of what you're showing us is the power of this very sophisticated theoretical take on a very difficult problem. And I think one of the things that is very striking, I think, as I think of the corrective, is trade might enrich a lot of specific people, but it seems to actually weaken states in the story that you're telling us, and I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. But let me start with one of the questions in our YouTube channel. So this one comes from Binah Keter. He or she, I do not know, asks, how do you understand the explosion of violence and the persistence of patrimonialism today in contemporary Latin America from this state building, state formation lenses? Is the extractive capacity of the state, part of, I think this is probably a second question, but it's probably part of the answer to your first question, the capacity of the state to levy taxes considered part of this bureaucratic dimension? So I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, this gives me the opportunity. I don't think I can answer very competently that question, or I think that I can give the framework better than answer the specific. So why weak states in Latin America, and what I mean by weak states? Originally, and this is for most part of the 20th century, with few exceptions of explosions of violence in Colombia, for instance, we have really strong states in the sense of strong territories with violence relatively unchallenged, or no secessionists or geopolitical conflicts in Latin America. You have that, and that in a way it's a success. Okay. On the other hand, you have pure poor administrations dominated by clientelism, patrimonialism, patronage, corruption, essentially. Okay, where does this come from? Okay, and so there is this issue that there are, essentially, in the book, you will see that there are two sources, independent sources of weakness, that they in a way, they interact, but they are independent. First, when states are formed through trade, and they are forged through trade, they don't develop this extractive capacity and this transformational capacity that the war-led cases had, because they had to make things very efficient. So that's one thing. So essentially, you have an administration that is clientelistic from the beginning. Okay, it's from the beginning is clientelistic. Then you have some cases, and Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina stand out here, that create a second source of weakness, which are territorial colossuses, and they are what I call dysfunctional combinations of regions, especially Argentina and Brazil. You have regions that are very wealthy, economically very dynamic, and you have peripheries that are stagnant, and those peripheries create a new layer, essentially, and the existence of those patrimonial peripheries create a new layer of weakness, which is all kinds of inefficient transfer from the center to the periphery. On top of that, you have, even though the Dutch disease was an invention of the 1960s in the theory, the peripheries in these countries are also hurt. It's not that only the center is hurt by patrimonial peripheries, but the peripheries are also hurt by very dynamic centers, because they essentially, the interest rate, the exchange rate by which northern Brazil can be competitive internationally is very different from that by which Sao Paulo can be competitive, or the same with Tucumán or the Argentine Bolivia that has in the north, and Buenos Aires. They are dysfunctional combinations of regions. So you have two sources of weakness: a corrupt state and colossuses that are dysfunctional territorial combinations. Those two things are bad. Eventually, what do we have from that? Well, we have these parties like the PRI in Mexico, or the Peronism in Argentina, in which you have a metropolitan part of that party, but then a peripheral part in which the exchange of favors and patronage is essentially the core activity of that party. So this creates incentives for a dynamics that I cannot exactly predict what is going to happen in the 20th century. And things change because you have the Great Depression, you have the Great Wars, you have industrialization, you have all kinds of changes. But the territorial combinations are permanent. They stayed permanent, and with their dysfunctionality, the rudiment of a big patronage state is still there. So then what happens? Well, if you have drugs, if you have a demand for drugs in the US, things are going to get nasty, obviously. So, but that is essentially the question I think is asking: how do these originally patrimonial states, and some of them dysfunctional territorial combinations, respond to a number of shocks, like the emergence of labor, the emergence of international drug trade, the third globalization, the emergence of China as a superpower, the third wave of globalization. So yes, so these states are not going to respond efficiently to all these shocks, and things may aggravate in a way. So I think that is the starting point.
Very interesting. This is great. Thank you. We have a question from Luciana Castro. I think it might be something about the audio, because she asks, how did Brazil desegregate since the 90s? But she's obviously, I think, trying to point out the questions of inequality and racial difference in Brazil. And I'm just going to use her question, because I think you were talking about disaggregation, like the dismembering of a unit into smaller units. But she is trying to ask us a little bit about this question of social division. Do you see, Sebastián, in some of the succession efforts, like an ethnic component or a racial component?
Yes,
I'm sorry, I'm
absolutely.
turning the Luciana Castro into the question.
No, I love that question. I love that question. It's the one. So the book has two parts. So in order to locate the answer to this question in the general theory, part 2 has its own theoretical chapter. Part 1 has and part 1 is about the distinction between Europe and Latin America, and then divisions with variation within Latin America of this trade-led path. And so there, I examine 3 structural, not agent-based explanations for potential incentives for aggregation and disaggregation of regions, right? And I talk about the economy, about military, and then about social. And one potential incentive for aggregation or disaggregation, right, is whether the center, if a periphery has slavery, right, whether the center is going to support that or is going to fight that. And so there is an incentive there. And the Brazilian case is very clear. The North wanted secession and could have secession, but it didn't have the military muscles to keep slavery in place. So essentially, they accepted incorporation into the empire because the empire could provide the coercion that the periphery did not have. So essentially, it played a role. So, but to tell the story properly of Brazil, there were some attempts at decentralization, at disaggregation, secession. Then there was second thoughts, especially in the Northeast, second thoughts because they realized that with secession they could not control a social rebellion, which is what happened in Yucatan. Then obviously the remaining question is what were the incentives for the center to provide repression to a periphery that doesn't matter that much. And that's when I mean, yeah, we can have a social division, social structure, explanation of aggregation, but it's not enough because you don't understand what the incentive from the central politician is to incorporate a periphery that is patrimonial. So that is why I have the port, the Rio de Janeiro, having a specific interest in incorporating that periphery, which is a political one, by the way, if you read it.
Sebastián, we have time probably just for a very short answer to a third question coming from the streaming, and I hope we can, do answer this one because I'm very curious about what you think about it. And it is a question about federalism, which is very dear to my heart. So the question is from Santiago Tomás Lacroix Eusler, and he asks, do federal institutions such that political autonomy is in the constituent units or some form of territorial representation exist, do they have any effect on this process of state formation and long-term development within your framework?
So thank you very much for the question. Thank you so much for the question. In the same chapter I was talking about, I talk about the bargaining between a center and a periphery or a number of peripheries. And essentially in the bargaining, there's a sort of a number of proposals that the center can make to the periphery and the periphery sort of counter back and so on. And essentially you have 4 possibilities: secession, confederation, federation, or unitary states. And I essentially have a theory of how these bargainings, these sort of institutional engineerings were an instrument of the state formation process. And you cannot imagine Argentina or Mexico being formed with this formula of territorial power sharing that is federalism. So essentially it is endogenous, or it's part of the bargaining that created these countries, and also allowed for patrimonial powers to persist, right? Because I mean, if you look at Argentina, it's just pretty incredible. I mean, it's like, in a way, it's like in Africa, you apply it's very easy to form a state in Africa. You apply to the United Nations and you become a state. And so there's really very little state formation there in the European or in the Latin American way. In Argentina, we had 13 provinces, which were not like the 13 colonies of the US. Some of them were like very, very, very poor villages, and actually a fiefdom. But at the time of the bargaining, they applied for statehood and they got it. Not like in the US, because in the US they wanted clones of Boston, of Massachusetts, essentially, or Pennsylvania or Virginia. Here, no clones got some statehood because there was an important power broker. And given that efficiency was not relevant because there was no war, there was no geopolitical survival, they got it. So essentially, federalism is endogenous to this process of state formation in these colossuses, okay?
Thank you so much, Sebastián. So this finishes the streaming of our webinar today. I want to thank you all for joining in and also for sending your questions. Do try to come and tune next week. We have a fantastic panel on Cuba in the 21st century. It's a panel with both scholars and professionals who are inside Cuba and outside Cuba, which will probably give us a very good perspective. And I do want to remind people there will be also some more additional events, like a conversation with Latin American authors on African in Action, which is part of our book presentations that we have been doing with UC Davis and San Jose State University. So I do remind you to look into our website if you want to know exactly when those additional events are happening. Thank you so much, Sebastián, and see you hopefully next week.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to share time with you guys and ideas and the great questions. Very thankful, genuinely thankful. Thank you very much.